Welcome back, everybody. We are now looking at our lecture on printmaking. So printmaking is the only two-dimensional art-making technique in which we are able to create multiples, meaning exact replicas, exact copies. They are each considered to be individual, unique works of art. They are usually signed and numbered in what we call a limited edition. But unlike painting or drawing, in which an artist can only make one unique original, with printmaking processes, the artist creates an image as what we call a matrix. The matrix is actually the master copy, so to speak, the carved or etched image on a printing surface that can be inked and then pressed to paper to transfer the image. So the printmaker is making the matrix, the master image, on a working surface, which we usually refer to as the printing plate. The edition is the total number of prints that are made. So when we talk about anything in a limited edition, it means there are only so many of the exact same thing. So the edition is usually indicated in a number that's written on the print as a fraction. So the number on the top tells you which of the prints you're looking at. The denominator, the second number, tells you how many prints total there are in that edition. So the example I've given you here is the fraction 2/20. You would be looking at print number 2 out of a total edition of 20 prints. We make prints along the way, though, to check progress. We call those the proofs. So any print that's made just to show how the work is going, to help guide the artist, would be called a proof. Those are usually destroyed. They're of no real value. There is one special print, though, that we keep to the side. That's known as the artist's proof. Usually it will say artist proof on it, or the initials AP, rather than an edition number. That is the final proof that all of the other prints in the edition need to look like. It is sort of the benchmark master copy. It is not included in the numbering. So in fact, if there is a number 2/20, there would be 21 prints because the artist proof doesn't count into the numbering. Registration is the method used for lining the block and paper up. This is especially important when you're doing multiple colors to make sure everything lines up properly. Your major print categories are relief, intaglio, stencil, lithographic, and monotype. So in the relief techniques, you may have made relief prints if you ever made potato stamps, if you ever did any stamping in doing scrapbooking, if you did a lino cut in middle school or high school, you're doing relief printing. In relief, we carve away the area that's going to be white. The area that's going to print is the part that's raised up, the uncut part. So woodcut and lino cut are your major relief techniques. Intaglio is the opposite of relief, and these techniques, which are always traditionally done on metal. Some of them can be done on modern substitutes like plexiglass, but traditionally done on copper. The image is scratched or etched into the surface. So the area that is cut or etched is the area that holds the ink. So they're the complete opposite of relief. Relief, you cut what's white. In intaglio, you cut where you want it to be black. So the intaglio allows for a little bit more detail. It allows for the use of hatching, cross-hatching, and stippling. Your major intaglio techniques are engraving, dry point, mezzotint, etching, and aquatint. These need to be printed using a printing press. You don't really have the ability to print these by hand, which you usually can do with woodcut and lino cut. The stencil category is very similar to cutting a stencil for spray painting. This is the technique that we refer to as silkscreen or screen printing. Planographic category is the category for lithography. Lithography is traditionally on limestone plates. These stone plates are drawn on with material that has a grease base. Wherever greasy material is applied, it eats away microscopically at the surface of the stone, leaving a reservoir that will accept ink. And so the lithograph can imitate many other art forms. It can look like a pencil drawing, a charcoal drawing, or even a watercolor painting. Monotypes are special types of prints. They're the only ones on this list that you would not be able to make multiple copies of the same image. Mono means one. So the monotype in this case is simply manipulating ink on a non-porous surface like a sheet of glass or metal and printing that resulting image to paper. So when we're working with most print techniques, with the exception of screen printing, you have to remember, if you're including numbers, letters, text of any kind, that the image prints backward from the plate. So in this woodcut, you can see there's a stop sign carved here with the letters not only in reverse order but reverse shape, because when it's printed, the image, of course, is going to backwards to the way it looks on the carved surface. This gives you an idea of why we do proofing. You can see here, everywhere that you see a pair of arrows in red is showing you the initial proof, which was made. The artist then made decisions about what to change, and you can see those changes being made here in this second proof that show you how the image evolved over a working period. Same thing is happening here. You can see paired up sections, arrows that show you where changes were in the image from the first state to the second. So artists will pull proofs along the way until they get the image looking the way they want it to look. Once they have achieved the correct image or the correct appearance, they'll print one copy on good paper. That'll be called the artist proof, and then the editioning happens. We make multiple copies of the same image until we have made as many as we intend to have in our edition. Your relief processes are kind of summarized for you here. Again, imagine it like a flat block. Whatever is cut away, if we're printing in black ink on white paper, the cutaway areas will be white. The raised areas receive the ink, and they will print as black. So woodcut and linocut are your main relief processes. Generally, we do our cutting with tools that we call gouge tools. They're shaped on their ends, either like V or a U, so they take a different amount of material away and they're pushed away from your body. The ink is applied to the plate using a tool called the brayer, which looks a little bit like a paint roller, but small and rubber. And then usually we can print these by hand. The paper is placed on top of the inked block, and then we rub or burn the back of the paper with something like a wooden spoon or a baren. These are some examples of woodcuts from the early 20th century, early to mid 20th century. The woodcut fell somewhat out of favor. It was a fairly well-known and well-used print process through the Renaissance, but as we started to make more use of engraving in metal, which allowed for a little bit more detail, the woodcuts fell somewhat out of favor. So it was revived in the 20th century by artists who were interested in abstraction, and that's what you're looking at here. It's the work of some 20th century German expressed artists. On this slide, you've got the woodcut gouge tools, the brayer for applying the ink, the tools that we use for burnishing, the baren. This is a bamboo leaf wrapped around a hard disc. This is a more modern synthetic substitute, but both use the same way for pressing on the back of the paper to transfer the design. This gives you an idea of the process. The first step usually is to draw the image to scale so that it is the right size of your block. Then, of course, the image has to be reversed, and so you can see the figure is on the left side of the drawing, but the figure is being carved on the right side of the block. So the image is reversed, put onto the block, and then cut away. And then this is our printing process. I've got my ink laid out here. I have my brayer. I've got a wooden spoon for burnishing the back. I'm about to ink the block and place it in this guide so that I can keep the paper in the proper orientation to my printing block. And this is an idea of how the edition begins to look. You're printing the same thing again and again until you have multiple copies of the same image. In this case, I'm making a version of this image in color, so I have a second block where I have carved away everything except the space of the clothing and the wall behind the figure, so I can print these in color. So you see I've rolled up the background in orange, the clothing in blue. So there's how strange this looks at first. We print the color first, and then the black and white on top of that, and that sort of is a coloring book in reverse. It puts the lines around the color that we've already made, so it creates a sense of a finished product that has black and color as well. These are some student examples of woodcuts. You see that generally with a woodcut, large areas of either solid black or solid white tend to work quite well. Believe it or not, these are woodcuts as well. This is on the left by Chuck Close, a woodcut that is done in the traditional Japanese style, where oftentimes the same block is printed with no changes in the carving, but with ink of various different colors to create blended effects. This is a 120 color print by Chuck Close on the left, and on the right, a print by Viha Selmans, who's a Latvian artist. It looks like a black and white photograph art, but it's in fact carved. So if you get really close to it, you can see the individual carved strokes in the water. It's pretty remarkable. Linoleum works the same way as wood. It is a more contemporary material. It is derived traditionally from cork, so it's very soft, but the same concept prevails. You carve away what is white, and what is left solid will print as black. You can see here the LinoCut tool has interchangeable blades, V and U shapes of different sizes. And here you can see two different materials. The lino comes either as gray or gold colored traditional linoleum, sometimes mounted to wood blocks, like this here that you see at the left. And then there are substitutes that we use that are synthetic rubbers. This is similar to the kind of material that you might use for an eraser. And because it's nice and thick, the advantage of this material is that you can, if you're careful, get an image carved on the front and the back to save a little money. These are some student lino cuts. You can see the advantage of the linoleum because it doesn't have a wood grain the way wood does. You can carve in any direction, so it's much easier to do curves and small linear details. Fish scales, hair, and in this case wood grain in the floor and in the land, really easy to do in linoleum. This is a lino cut, in fact, the first linoleum cut print that this student ever made. This is Jacob Parker, who recently completed his master's in printmaking and is now a professional working artist as well, but started at Cape Fear. So again, our slogan is always start here, go anywhere. You really can. So you can see that the linoleum is very popular among Cape Fear students. We offer 2 courses in printmaking, ART111 and ART232. This is a piece by a professional contemporary artist and friend of mine, Bill Fick. He is well known for these large-scale, kind of cartoonish, gory-ish monster faces. And you can see his installation. This is an exhibition of prints that have been printed and hung all along an entire wall here, as well as on shirts. I'm going to skip ahead from wood engraving to the collograph. Collograph is a technique similar to collage, in which we make an image for printing by gluing together or collaging elements onto a piece of cardboard or other soft material, then inking and printing them. This is a student collograph. You could make a collograph from plants, from leaves. They actually work really well. And this is a student collage that we made by taking the bottoms of plastic, soda, and water bottles and pressing them under a lot of pressure to emboss them into a soft cardboard, and then inking the cardboard and printing it. So the embossed section reads as white. And then some professional examples of the collograph, Jet James on the left, and a mentor of mine, Glenn Ewer from North Carolina, on the right. The intaglio techniques, again from the Italian term for to incise or to engrave, need to be done on metal plate. Usually they're done on copper. It we do dry point and engraving at Cape Fear on plexiglass, but for the prints that we make on campus using mezzotint or any acid techniques, including etching and aquatint, you really do have to use the copper plate. So in dry point, a dry point needle is used to scratch a line into the metal surface. We call that material the dry point needle. And the line that you're scratching in, it also creates a slight raised area of the material beside the cut. We call that the burr, and that also helps hold the ink. So a dry point will look a little bit more like a soft pencil line compared to engraving. In an engraving, we use a tool called a burrin, and we incise the line into the surface of the plate. No burr is raised, so it's a nice even line. It looks a little bit more like what a pen looks like when it's drawn on nice smooth paper. In the mezzotint technique, we roughen the entire surface of the plate with a tool called a rocker. Then if we were to ink it and print it, we would have a solid black rectangle. So in order to create the image, you use a tool called a burnisher to smooth areas out to make lighter grays, and a scraper to remove the burrs completely to create areas of pure white. So the mezzotint can look very much like a charcoal drawing with a very dark ground. With etching, we don't actually scratch into the metal ourselves at all. We paint an acid-resistant coat called the ground onto the plate. We use an etching needle to scratch the lines that we want just through the ground itself. We're not even scratching into the metal at all, just exposing the metal. We then place the metal in what we call the acid bath. On campus, we don't use the traditional acids anymore, which produce toxic gas. We use ferric chloride, which is a salt solution, but it still eats away at the copper. Wherever the copper is eaten away, ink will stick into that area and be printable onto paper. The aquatint is an etching technique in which we do multiple etches, and that allows us to create a variety of different light and dark values. Traditionally, the way it's done is to place a stop out or use the ground to paint areas that are going to be white. Then a light dusting of resin powder is put across the surface. That powder is then heated, so it bonds to the plate, so it's almost like a little sprinkling of little dots. We use spray paint as a substitute today. It's a little safer for you. The acid then is able to eat at the plate all around those little dots. And so we etch in very short etches, remove the plate, cover areas that we want to be a light value, and etch the whole thing again. So areas that are etched a second time, etch a little deeper, making the value darker, and we keep doing that. Short etches, blocking sections, etching again. The areas that are etched the longest will have the darkest values. But in all of the intaglio techniques, the idea is that the ink goes into the areas that have been etched or carved into the plate. So we apply ink to the whole surface and then wipe it off again. And the wiping process actually forces the ink down into the grooves, but cleans it off of the area meant to be white. Then that's why we need the printing press, because you wouldn't be able to get the ink out of the grooves unless there was an enormous amount of pressure. So we use dampened paper, not soaking wet but not dry, on top of the plate, run it through the printing press, and the pressure of the press forces the paper down into the grooves, picks up the ink. So here's a very simple printing press and some examples of copper and zinc plates. Here's the application of the ink. We usually apply it with soft, like a piece of rubber, or in this case, a card, like a piece of mat board cut into a rectangle, being used as a squeegee to scrape the ink across. Here's the ink being wiped off. Now ink is down in the grooves. We're ready to print. So the plate has been placed on the printing press. We're going to put dampened paper on top of that and run the roller across, and that'll print the image. These are some professional examples. This is an engraving by Albrecht Dürer, which includes an incredible amount of very small details. So you can see the difference between woodcut or lino cut, the relief techniques, and the engraving technique. With the relief technique, you get bold, crisp, black, white, solid areas. With engraving, it's much easier to get smaller specific details, but also to create an effect of a gradient rather, from light to dark, through the use of hatching, cross-hatching, and or stippling. These are the engraving tools, the burins, which are shafts with very sharp points, and they're slightly bent, as you can see, especially on the top left. You can really see how the shaft has a bend in it. That's so that you can get your palm in this area and still have your fingers able to get around it to guide it, because this tool needs to be held almost completely flat against the surface of the plate to make the marks. Here you can see an artist really with very little space at all between the shaft and the metal plate incising these lines. These are some pieces by former Cape Fear students. September Kruger, who was actually doing the demo of scraping the ink gloss and wiping it in the previous shots, graduated from Cape Fear, then from ECU, and she was then the lead art instructor at Southeastern Community College in Whiteville. She's now working in the education department at the museum in town, the Cameron Art Museum, which is dedicated to North Carolina artists. Some other Cape Fear student self-portraits in the engraving technique. So you can see how this ties to what we learned about in drawing and in value with hatching and cross-hatching. Another professional example from the Renaissance, the art of Martin Schongauer. This is St. Anthony being beset by demons. When you get really close to the surface, you can really see how the engraving does look a lot like a pen and ink drawing, but imagine being able to make multiple exact duplicates of this image. That's precisely why printmaking is so valuable to us. Now, this looks somewhat like a pen and ink drawing, but if you look closely, the lines do seem to waver in and out a little bit. They change from lighter to darker. This is the effect of dry point, and in this cross section, you can see the plate has been scratched, and there's a burr raised up beside the scratch. The burr will help hold the ink and create kind of a soft effect. This is a dry point by Picasso. The dry point needle is the least sophisticated tool of all. It can be any really sharpened metal cylinder shaft, and so these are a variety of different dry point needles. And this is a plexiglass plate that we've used at Cape Fear for printing. It's cheaper than copper, and the other advantage is that you can put a drawing or even a photograph under the plexiglass to help guide you. So this is the plate, and this is the resulting print. Again, I just wanted to remind you that notice the pagoda is on the right on the plate and on the left in the print. Everything reverses in these processes. Cape Fear student, dry point close-up of an elephant's skin around his eye. Professional dry point series by Alan Flood, pretty remarkable portrait series. So you can see how effective these can be, very direct and emotional kind of imagery. I thought you guys would like this. You already know the art of M.C. Escher. This is a mezzotint by him. So as much as this looks like a charcoal drawing, in fact, this is ink on paper from a printing plate, and an exact duplicate of this can be made by re-inking the plate and printing it again and again. So the mezzotint is probably the most time-consuming one. You see here a diagram of arrows showing you the multiple directions that you have to use the tool known as the rocker. The idea of the rocker is almost like a paddle with a curved surface, and that curved end rocks back and forth, and at the end of that curve are lots of little tiny little teeth. And so as you rock back and forth across the surface, it creates burrs all over that metal. So if I were to ink this, once I've completely covered the surface with burrs, I would have a completely solid black rectangle. To create the values, I'll use this tool at the top known as the burnisher, which will allow me to smooth or beat down some of those burrs to create grays, or this scraper, which is, if you look at the end of it, shaped kind of like a triangle. Anywhere that two flat sides comes together creates a blade, and so that blade can be used to scrape the surface to make it completely free of burrs to create areas that are white. So here's a mezzotint, again by September Kruger, a flamingo. Some other student mezzotints. Don't they look like black and white charcoal drawings? You can really create this incredible atmospheric effect. Probably the most famous mezzotint artist in the world is black. She literally wrote the book on mezzotint. It's called Mezzotint, but it tells you the history of the technique and all of the various tools and materials that are needed. But her work generally is just exquisite in terms of this incredible ability to create highlight and a transition from the lightest light to the darkest dark. But you notice mezzotint that primarily the majority value is dark. These, I suppose you could say, really are low-key images with some high contrast. This is an etching by my own grandfather, in fact. The etching process is really kind of interesting. You cover the material, the copper plate, with an acid-resistant ground. And the traditional ground that was used is black. It's called asphaltum. It is the same as the chemical element in asphalt that makes the material of the road stick together, and it is very toxic to breathe. Once the ground is applied, we use this tool called a twisted scribe, or an etching needle, just to scratch through the ground to expose the metal underneath so that we can put it in the acid. Here we're using a less toxic alternative. We're painting paste wax or furniture wax onto our copper plate. Once it hardens, we'll scratch the design through it and then expose the image to ferric chloride, which is a salt solution. Here you see the drawings being transferred. And here, although it's not the greatest image in the world, you can see that the lines have been scratched through the wax, not into the copper, just to expose the copper through the wax. Here's the source image. Funny, right? But here's what ferric chloride looks like. You can see that it's actually turning darker where the areas have been scratched away. So as this solution that looks about the color of sweet tea, once it starts to eat away at the copper, it starts to darken up. So you can really see that it's doing its work. It's been exposed for about 10 minutes there. So this is an example, again, of a print on the left and the plate on the right. So you can really see the lines that have been eaten into the copper. And of course, you can see that once we apply the ink and wipe it properly, it's going to allow us to reproduce what looks like a pen or pencil drawing over and over again. This is the work of Rembrandt. I just wanted you to see a couple of examples of his, because he often would print work at a stage to check progress and then continue to work on that same image. So here you can see that as he worked on it, the image became darker and darker and darker, obscuring more and more of these details. It originally started as all of the figures as just simple outlines. Contemporary etching by Jim Dine. And the aquatint process, probably the hardest one to understand, but essentially the idea is that in multiple etches, you'll be able to create a multitude of different values. So with this less toxic material, what I usually do is use paste wax to paint what I want to be white. Then I apply a spray paint layer, and if you look closely, you can see that it's not solid at all. It's a series of dots with space in between. That's going to allow the copper to be eaten by my etched by the ferric chloride. If it was completely covered in solid paint of spray paint, it would not allow me to etch at all. If there was no spray paint there at all, it would all etch to the same level, and we'd get no place for the ink to stick. So we need that little intermittent spotty approach of the spray paint, which is a substitute, of course, for our toxic resin. So basically, in step one there, you see I've got a couple of rectangles I've painted in. That's my stop out. I've then applied my spray paint in the second layer. Then I've etched it, cleaned it. I've now applied some more stop out that are marked B, and I'll etch again, clean it, and I'll cover more areas now marked with the letter C. So what's happened here is everything that was covered in the first round has stayed covered the whole time. So this is going to be white. This area got exposed once and then covered, so it's going to become a light gray. This area was exposed to acid twice and then covered, so it's going to be a dark gray. But all the surrounding area has now been exposed 3 different times. It's going to etch really, really dark. So the final print should look something like this: white, light gray, middle gray, and black. So here's an aquatint plate being etched. You can see again it's darkening where the plate is being eaten by the copper, ferric chloride rather. And then these arrows kind of guide you to see white, light gray, middle gray, and our deepest blacks. So usually with aqua tint, it's combined with another technique. I usually go in and add linear marks with dry point or with engraving lines to help make the image easier to read. Here are some student aqua tints after being completed. And this is a student aqua tint that is also a monoprint. And a monoprint is a little different from a monotype. In this case, it is each one individually hand-colored, so no two are exactly alike, but it's the same image from the same matrix, hence monoprint as opposed to monotype. Probably the most successful and well-known artist to use aqua tint was our own American Mary Cassatt. She was a member of the French Impressionists living and working abroad in Paris during the era of the French Impressionists, the mid-1800s to the late 1800s. And so you see here images that look like watercolor paintings with pen lines drawn on top of them. They are in fact prints. This is from a series of images. I believe there are 10 altogether in this set, and the museum in town, the Cameron Art Museum, actually owns a complete set of these prints. They're one of the few museums in the entire world to have a complete set of these images by Cassatt. Some contemporary examples of intaglio with etching and aqua tint. And then lithography. Lithography is, again, done on limestone. So in fact, litho means stone. So you're seeing, in fact, is an image that's made by drawing on limestone with grease-based drawing materials. The grease eats away at the stone on a microscopic level, and then ink can be applied to that surface, and it'll replicate exactly how the drawing looks. Now, the stones themselves are very heavy, but they are reusable. Once you have finished printing, you use a tool that you see here called the levigator, which is used to grind the top surface of the stone away so that we're then able to put a new image on it. So here's a stone that has been prepared for printing. It has been inked, and you can see it as a reproduction of this image of a rhinoceros by Albert Dürer. So really the lithography technique can imitate almost any other print technique. Here's a lithograph by a Cape Fear student that looks a little bit like a crayon drawing. These are lithographs by Toulouse-Lautrec that look more like screen prints, really. They look almost like silkscreen prints, but in fact the graphs that were made to advertise the Moulin Rouge. Some contemporary stone litho examples. Which brings us to screen printing or silk printing. So a very simple way of doing screen printing is to think of it the same way as you would as making a stencil for spray paint. We can actually take a silkscreen screen and cut a stencil from shelf liner paper or contact paper, which can then be stuck to the surface of the screen, and then ink will pass through the gaps, and that's in fact how this simple print was made. It's a very simple hand-cut stencil technique. But most people nowadays use what we call the photo emulsion process. So in the photo emulsion process, at the top left corner, you see the artist is applying photo emulsion to the screen. Now this is a chemical solution that is sensitive to light. So once the screen has been coated, it has to be kept in the dark until you're ready to put the image onto the screen. So the way that we do that is we put our artwork in absolute jet black on a completely transparent sheet, like a piece of plastic. That is then put against the surface of the photo emulsion itself, and the whole thing's exposed to light. So wherever the light can go through this plastic, it hits the emulsion and turns it hard. Where it's blocked from the plastic by the black of the design, the emulsion beneath that stays soft. It can then be sprayed out with a high-pressure hose, and it creates a stencil on this surface. Then ink is put into the screen and squeegeed across using a squeegee, and so the ink goes through the holes. So even though the initial artwork was in black, you can see here that the print on the shirt is in yellow, because of course you could use whatever color ink once the stencil has been made. Here's some examples of modern use of silkscreen printing. This is Andy Warhol in his factory creating his Campbell Soup series. Some screens that were burned and printed in our own studio on campus. You can see students are making artwork on paper. They are making work printed on fabric as banners. They're making t-shirts. You can really get an incredible amount of detail with the screen process. And then again, this is Jacob Parker. We saw some of his work when we looked at our first examples of linoleum cut. These are some of his pieces from his MFA exhibition in screen printing at Ohio University. And another professional artist who you might like, Carlos Hernandez, who has made an entire career out of using screen printing for doing not only his own original work, but also making poster designs for various famous bands at various venues. The monotype technique, again, is mono meaning one, type meaning print. What you're looking at is the additive process in action. Here we are painting some ink onto a sheet of glass and then printing it to paper. So that's how additive process works. There's a series of layers of additive monotype to create this final look. So somewhat similar to painting. The subtractive technique is kind of similar to woodcut or lino. We roll out an area of ink and then scrape away what we don't want to be there, print it. These are subtractive examples. And then the drawn from behind technique, or the trace technique. In this technique, we coat the entire piece of glass with ink, very light, thin layer of ink, put a piece of paper on top of it, and then draw on the back of the paper with a pen. And wherever the pen pressure hits, it picks up more ink. So here's some student examples of all of those techniques combined. In print class, I usually ask people to experiment with all of the techniques and create a group of images for that project. So here you see a subtractive, additive, and a trace. This monotype examples by the San Francisco, California artist Nathan Oliveira. Our next topic will be photography.